When I first saw the trailer for the movie American Sniper, I emphatically stated that I was not going to go and watch that movie. Too much violence and tension and pain. And then it was nominated for a bunch of Oscars, and I knew I was in trouble. And so I went, in the name of research. And I will say that there are scenes in that movie that were so disturbing that I could not watch them. It is a movie that is derived from the memoir of Chris Kyle, that he wrote about his several tours of duty as a Navy SEAL sniper in Iraq. It is a story of a young man raised in the gun culture of Texas who sought his living on the rodeo circuit and then opted for Navy SEAL training. His expert marksmanship earned him training as a sniper, part of a team entrusted with protecting troops and enabling their advance in the battle zone. The movie implies that he was especially suited for this, as he was raised to believe that there were three kinds of people in the world: evil wolves, vulnerable sheep, and sheepdogs who protect the vulnerable sheep from the evil wolves. He was raised as an older brother to be a sheepdog. So in the situation of war, he was suited to that interpretation of his job. The movie is about his attachment, or maybe his addiction, to that job, and his drive to re-enlist for more tours time after time, despite his family's need for him at home. The movie is also about PTSD and the shift in moral compass required from peace zone to war zone and back again. And it's about the lack of reorientation for military personnel between those two environments. But aside from war, this movie is also about a man's racism, his addiction to firearms, and his own ego. Now, this sniper, Chris Kyle, had a colleague, Mark Lee. While Kyle viewed Iraqis as savages, Mark wrote home about his own broadening perspective. He said, "I have seen amazing things happen here. However, I have seen the sad part of war too. I have seen the morals of a man who cared nothing about human life. I have seen hate towards a nation's people who have never committed a wrong except being born in a third world. It brings questions to mind. Is it okay for one to consider themselves superior to another race? Surprisingly, we are not a stranger to this sort of attitude, meaning that in our own country, we discriminate against someone for what nationality they are, their education level, their social status. My point of this is, how can we come over here and help a less than fortunate country without holding contempt or hate towards them if we can't do it in our country? I think the truth to our greatness is each other. Purity, morals, and kindness passed down to each generation through example. So to all my family and friends, do me a favor and pass on the kindness, the love, the precious gift of human life to each other, so that when your children come into contact with a great conflict that we are now faced with here in Iraq, that they are people of humanity, of pure motives, of compassion." It was his last letter home, where Mark was killed, and the movie depicts his death and the reading of this letter at his funeral. But the screenwriter chose to have Chris Kyle say in the movie that this attitude was what made this soldier let down his guard, become a sheep, and lose his life. Now, while that comment given in the movie was an invention, it certainly served to portray the mindset that drove Kyle. Now, Garrett Reppenhagen was another American sniper. You have to realize that after you watch this movie, you have to go like, is this what all of them think? So you have to look around. Garrett Reppenhagen writes that his experience and attitude toward the Iraqi people was also very different from Kyle's, and that multitudinous factors impact a person's perspective on their military experience. He advises that, like a sniper, those who watch this movie need to keep a 360 degrees of awareness and access more than one perspective. And remember that it's just a movie that was ultimately penned by a Hollywood screenwriter. So what does all this have to do with Noah? Well, in the part of Noah's story read this morning, God does something very significant. God surveys the damage wreaked by God's own anger and frustration upon the beloved creation, a great flood. And God says, I'm done. I promise to the whole earth that I won't ever do this again. I'm hanging my bow, and the word here is for the archer's bow. I'm hanging my bow up in the sky, and when I see it there, it will remind me of this promise that I am making. Our ancestors believed that God had hung up God's violence, that God would find another way to deal with problems. Now, I know that this story, from its own particular time and tradition, stands against other writings in the Hebrew Scriptures from other periods and other traditions, writings that set up other cultures as evil and idolatrous and substandard and due for a good smiting. But this one is one of the oldest stories. And while it may be an ancient myth, as such, it is meant to convey the nature of God. That this God repents. This God commits to nonviolence. This God will not choose between races anymore. This God decides to love even the most difficult. And this God, says the rainbow with its multicolored glory, is violence transformed. It is peace. And so it isn't unusual that one of the commandments to the Hebrew people is, thou shalt not kill. And it isn't unusual that Jesus should go a step further and say in the 5th chapter of Matthew that the extension of that commandment is that even if you're angry with someone, move fast to fix it. Because there are many kinds of violence, verbal as well as physical, and we are to be careful with each other. We are to be gentle with each other. Likewise, the first mindfulness training, interwoven with the Four Noble Truths of the Buddhist tradition, is about hanging up your violence. Its title is Reverence for Life, and the practitioner promises to cultivate the insight that all life is interwoven, to practice compassion, and learn ways to protect the lives of people, animals, plants, and minerals. The practitioner determines not to kill or support killing in my thinking or in my way of life. Seeing that harmful actions arise from anger, fear, greed, and intolerance, which in turn come from dualistic and discriminative thinking, the practitioner says, I will cultivate openness, non-discrimination, and non-attachment to views in order to transform violence, fanaticism, and dogmatism in myself and in the world. All of these practices are about moving from self-centeredness to hanging up the bow. Much of the commentary around the movie American Sniper is argument about its portrayal of anger, fear, greed, and intolerance as part of the package that supports a righteous patriotism and heroism. And this commentary asks if it's right that Hollywood should support this highly charged energy. And if you're a CBC listener, there was yet another discussion on Friday morning on The Current. These discussions will continue for a while, I'm sure. But aside from what nations do, or what the film industry does, the scriptures call us to look deeply into our own lives and to ask upon this Lenten journey, what violence do I need to hang up? It's even part of our language. I was so mad I could have killed him, right? How can we be less harmful when we're angry? Is our speech harsh and mean? What fear separates us from engaging our neighbor or our world? Where do we catch ourselves feeling superior to others and getting suspicious of them? On the downtown sidewalk? At work? This is all daily stuff. I know I bump into this all the time in myself. It isn't easy to hang up the bow. Like Jesus, we get driven into the wild places of the heart and the mind, and we are tempted, and we struggle. But asking the questions and becoming aware is an important part of this path. Working to transform our own violence and dogmatism, that's part of it. But practicing, and we're not going to get it right the first time or even maybe the 100th, but practicing reconciliation, cultivating openness, they are challenging spiritual practices that get us to grow in the way of Jesus. So maybe some of that can be our steps of the Lenten journey this week. To be aware of the kinds of inner violence with which we walk, and see if there are ways that we can take care of our own stuff before we get distracted by how terrible others are. Maybe we commit this week to taking a pause of 10 breaths before we speak to someone with whom we are angry. Or we see a panhandler as a person and say good day to them. Or maybe we simply see our own offenses and apologize. See what happens. See what part of all of this might come up for you this week. And so as we walk with God this week, may there be rainbows in the sky of our souls. Amen.